Okay, so the next thing is loops and other kind of conditional tests. So these are what we call control structures that allow you to control flow through your program. So you might want your program to do the same thing several times until some condition is met. So we'll just cover the kind of the general structure of these at the beginning here, and then we'll go through some examples. So first we have an if test. So here is where you say if something is true, and this is where you get into these truth statements that we just covered. So if you do evaluate some statement, if that thing is true, then you're going to do the code that then you're going to do the code that is below the block, and your Jupyter notebook and your IPython prompt as well will handle the indentation for you, but in Python the indentation matters. So we start here with this if statement and then a colon, and then after that all of the statements that should be executed inside that block, if the if statement is true, should be indented. And typically we use 4 single spaces. So 4 spaces or a tab, or you can, if you want, you can use 8 spaces or 2 spaces, but you have to be consistent. I would recommend you just use 4 spaces, but your notebook is going to do this automatically for you, so you shouldn't have to be typing lots of spaces unless you're editing the code. And if you don't indent properly, it'll give you an error. The reason for this is that unlike other programming languages which use like curly braces or other text to say here's a new block of code, Python tries to be cleaner. It tries to remove as much extra keystrokes as possible so it's easier to read, and so therefore the way that it marks when there's a block of code is with indentation, so just white space. So after you have this if statement and you have some statements that you would execute in that block, if it's true, there's other options. That could be all you have in your if statement. Oftentimes it is, but if you want to have a second option, say, so that would be executed if this is not true, then it will go on to the next if statement. This is else if, and in Python it's abbreviated elif, E-L-I-F, but that stands for else if. So if that if statement is false, then it will go on to this next if statement, and then if that's true, it'll execute this other stuff. And then optionally, you have another final option, which is just else. So if nothing else is true, this last bit will be executed. I would say by far the most common use of if statements is just a single if, do this thing, and then if not, you just keep going. So there's also a few kinds of loops. So a while loop is something that will make a test, and instead of doing if, it's while. So it's as long as this is true, keep going through this loop. And so it will basically make this test, and that test usually concerns what's going to be done in the statement below. So eventually, the idea is that eventually you will make some changes in the statement that now make the while test false, and so then it will exit. If the while test is not true at any point, then you have optionally the option to put this else statement in here. Another way you can do a while loop is to add an if test inside the while loop that could either continue, which would be to go back and run the test again, or to break, which would be to go to break out of the loop entirely. So there's some additional things you can add. These are a little harder to visualize without examples, but if you're familiar with control structures in other languages, this gives you some background for Python. And then finally, the last loop I wanted to cover here is for loops. So this is really handy to iterate over the items in an object. So you can say, like, for each element in this list, do something. And again, we have an optional else statement there, and we have optional just break and continue kind of controls as well. Again, the most common way to do a for loop would just be the basic for something in this object and to do something every time you go through. The other kind of control structure that we saw when we were talking about files, reading and writing files, was that with statement. Remember, we said with open as target for writing, or with open as, just to read. That was another kind of block. And when we exited out that block, remember we didn't have to close the file anymore, because that was kind of built into the way that with worked with the open function. So this will be more clear when we go through these examples. So first of all, if we're going to say if 1 is less than 2, it's going to print this sentence, the if statement is true. So 1 is less than 2, so that should print. Here we have an example where the statement is false. It says 3 is less than 2, but we know that's false. So if that was true, it would say the if statement is true. Else, it'll say the if statement is false. So you can see what happened was it first evaluated this statement, 3 less than 2. That evaluated as false. So it skipped over this block entirely and went to the else block. Finally, as I said, indentation matters. So I've commented this out so that when we run the notebook, it'll all run perfectly. But if we remove these comments and execute the cell, it's going to give it an indentation error. It says it expected an indented block because I put an if there. So if I just hit tab, that's going to fill in 4 spaces. So the notebook is smart. I hit the tab button. It doesn't put in a tab. It puts in 4 spaces, which it knows that's like how much I want to indent. So now if I execute that, everything is good. So I'm just going to return this back to how it was. I'm going to hit Command Z. You don't have to do that, but it's a handy little shortcut. That's undo. It'll undo what I did in that cell when I have that cell selected. Okay, the next one up is a for loop. So I can say for I in range 5. This is the same as saying for I in the list 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, but it's a shorthand. It's going to print this string I is I, and it's going to just go through that loop, and that list or that range object has 5 elements, so it's going to do this loop 5 times, and then when it's done, it's done. So it's a very simple thing, but you can imagine being able to do some nice stuff with this kind of construct. So another case where now we're combining a for loop with an if and else statement. So for I in range 5, we're going to print I just to see where we are, and then we're going to say if I is in. So this, we haven't really covered this, but in has a special statement, which is a way to see if an object is in a list, or it also works with sets. So if I in 1 and 2, it'll say it's 1 or 2. Else, if I is in this list 3 or 4, it'll print it's 3 or 4. Else, it'll say it must be 0. So when we execute that, it's going to print I, and then so I starts out as 0. So these two statements aren't true. So this text isn't printed. it then prints this final else statement. And then we go back, and now I is 1. It's going to print 1, and then it's going to say if 1 is in 1 or 2, so that's true, so it's going to print it's 1 or 2, and then it's going to go back up to the next entry in the range. So that's 2, that's 1 or 2. The next one is 3, so that's going to not be in 1 or 2, so it's going to skip this and go to this next else if statement. 3 is 3 in 3 or 4, yes, so it's going to print this. Then for 4, it's going to do the same thing, and that's it. Now, if you want to see how this break command works, we can uncomment this, and now it's as soon as we get to this statement, it's going to print it must be 0 and then break out of this loop, so it won't execute the rest of the range. So the while loop is the last one here I wanted to cover. So what we're going to do in this case is we're going to start j at 0, and then we're going to say while j is less than or equal to 5, it's going to print j, do j plus equals 1. Remember, that's the same as j equals j plus 1. And then I'm going to leave that commented right now for now. And then if the while loop is not true, it will then print this else statement. So if we hit Shift Enter and execute that, it's going to start out, okay, so j is 0. So while j is less than or equal to 5, so 0 is less than or equal to 5, so it's going to print 0. It's then going to say j is j plus 1, so j is now going to be 1. And now we're going to go back and evaluate again, and now we'll print 1, etc. until j is no longer less than or equal to 5. That's when it's 6. Right? So if we add another cell here and just type j is actually 6 when this thing exits. We just don't see that value printed. Another thing we can do is inside the inside the while loop, we can say if. Let's say we want to break after j is 4. We can do this. And so here it stops when j is 4, so the last thing that's printed is 3. And so j would be 4. And I'll change this back.